When I was doing the abstract theory of growth that I was referring to in the early stage of my career, there were two people who were coming up at various stages in their career through the World Bank that I learned an enormous amount from. One was Bill Easterly, who many of you know and who you'll hear from later today. The other was Lant Pritchett. And I wanted to start today with a story that Lant tells about development. He describes being on an evaluation team funded by the World Bank in a country in the developing world where they were evaluating a project that was trying to encourage women's self-help groups. And a woman they were interviewing asked the members of the team, "You're from countries that are so much richer than ours. Could you tell us about how you run your women's self-help groups?" And Lant looked around to the other members of the team, someone from the UK, someone from New Zealand, himself from the United States, someone from Germany. And none of the four of them knew if their countries had ever had women's self-help groups. They had never participated in one. They didn't know anything about women's self-help groups. And this prompted Lant to write that if you want to go into a developing country and tell people you should do X because X will be very important in helping you become as wealthy as the UK, Germany, the United States, New Zealand. If you want to do that, you probably want to pick something like X, which varies by at least an order of magnitude, a factor of 10, because that's the kind of variation we see in income across countries. You'd want to pick something which a country like the United States or Germany or England had much less of when it was poorer and then got a lot more of as it became richer. You'd want to pick something where if you look across countries now, you see that the countries poor today have much less of than the countries that are rich have. And you'd even like to look for cases where there are countries where for a period of time they don't have very much X, they start to accumulate a lot of X, and their income starts to grow much more rapidly along the way. And if you use those criteria, many of the things that are the focus of most academic research and development right now don't qualify. Women's self-help groups, and he gives this long list: conditional cash transfers, unconditional cash transfers, deworming, improved stoves, a whole litany of small programs and small initiatives, some of which are maybe worthy, some of which may be worth doing, but they're not good candidates for understanding the big drivers of economic growth and economic development. So if we could have the slides up now. Okay. I want to try and talk about things that I think are candidates and what governments might do to influence those things. Now, perfect. So urbanization is the thing I will focus on most. This is a candidate to be one of these X variables. It's changed dramatically over time. It varies dramatically across countries. It's a very big development. But it's linked to other things that are comparable. Industrialization, and in particular in the early stages of development, employment in formal sector manufacturing activities is also something which is a big candidate for X. Human capital is, of course, is arguably the most plausible candidate for an X-type variable, that nothing is as closely associated with successful development as the accumulation of high levels of human capital. And related to this, we see GDP growth. And from GDP growth, you have financing for things like infrastructure, which is pivotal for urbanization. In the background, I didn't link it as in this chain as an independent variable, but in the background, we also want to think about the rule of law, because, as I'll argue, the rule of law is very important for successful urbanization, for life when people group together in these very dense cities. So these are the kinds of things that you could think about as the possible big drivers of economic development. And the circular causal flow here that I've indicated with the arrows should make us pause to recognize that even if these are candidates for an X variable, this doesn't tell us necessarily where a government can most successfully intervene to speed up some kind of reinforcing process that can lead to very rapid growth. So, for example, you might think that the most successful, the most effective thing a government could do is intervene directly in education. Educate people, raise human capital, this will start the cycle going. And this has been a big focus at places like the World Bank. In general, the results from this focus, I think, are disappointing. One, it turns out to be very difficult to build a good school system, a system that produces better educated students when they leave the school system. It's a harder challenge than we might have thought in the beginning. It's hard to improve a school system. As we found, even in the United States, we have not had much success improving our school system in the last 20 years. And even if you did improve the quality of the school system, suppose you doubled the amount of knowledge, human capital, that people left the school system with. It still takes 50 years to double the stock of human capital in your workforce. So improving school systems is itself a slow process. Improving human capital in the labor force is an even slower process. So even as we think about improving educational systems, just like we think about addressing things like stoves that produce too much pollution and bed nets that can prevent malaria, we might conclude that it's hard to intervene in a big way and rapidly speed up this cycle that can lead to development through improvements in the educational system. Now, the argument I want to make today is that where governments can be particularly influential, even governments that have relatively limited capacity, governments that can do relatively little in the early stages of development, the place where they can intervene effectively is through the process of urbanization. And I'll describe in more detail what they can do there. One of the things I'm going to try and persuade you of is that we don't have to wait for the financing for the infrastructure to make a difference in urbanization, and that the role of the government, its most important role, is not in the financing of infrastructure. There are very big numbers associated with the amount of infrastructure that will be required to accommodate all the people who want to move into urban areas. I'll talk about this in a minute. Those big numbers can sound very scary, and if we think that the government has to come up with the financing for that kind of infrastructure before anything else can happen in this causal chain, we're going to be stuck forever. Instead of waiting for Godot, it's going to be waiting for the infrastructure, and this cycle will never get going. So there's something governments can do that can speed this process up that's independent of and easier to accomplish than providing all the infrastructure. And I won't talk about this much more today, but you want to think about formal sector employment as something that produces human capital, perhaps even more effectively than education in many of these countries. To try this test, if you don't believe me, speak to a businessman in some country and describe two identical students, say twins, one of whom gets one more year of education in high school in their national system, the other of whom works for a year at Toyota. And then ask the business person, which of these two students would you rather hire as an employee? You won't be surprised to learn that there's an overwhelming preference for the student who went and did a year of work at Toyota. So think of employment in manufacturing as a way to raise skill, to teach people about working in teams, the basics of quality control, meeting a rigid quality threshold, working with supervisors, working with modern machinery, modern management methods. Think of manufacturing employment as something that provides very powerful skills for life in the modern world. And think of it as something, it's a kind of education which could be provided by the private sector and which could be available to all adults. And then you can see how some process which encourages urbanization, encourages manufacturing employment, and I'll come back and say why formal sector employment I think is so critical for this, and then speeds up the accumulation of GDP, helps you finance infrastructure, helps you finance a better school system, and can get this process going rapidly. Now, the last thing I'll say about this last point is that it takes a willingness to let the market function if you want to rely on this mechanism. People may be willing to go work in a formal sector job that will provide them better skills and better lifetime employment prospects. They may be willing to work at a very low wage. I mean, if you think of high school as a job where people get paid nothing, where we actually force people to go do a job where they get paid nothing, a tedious job, a job where you've got to raise your hand to go to the bathroom, then it's not unreasonable that we should say, well, if there's another job that someone would like to go pursue, perhaps at a relatively low starting wage, we should let them do that. So you need some tolerance for the market, some acceptance of low wages that let people get employed in the formal sector, because it can provide those benefits perhaps even more valuable than the benefits from school. So the government has to tolerate that. And just as some schools are much better at providing skill than other schools, some jobs will be much better at providing human capital than other jobs. Formal sector jobs, on average, will expose people to better educated managers, more modern techniques, and will typically be better places to develop human capital. So we want to think about the measure of success on this dimension is employment in the formal sector, and this is available to countries throughout the world now through this sort of global supply chains that make it possible for foreign firms to bring in large numbers of employment opportunities very quickly to any country that will accommodate them. So what will it take to make this work? It will take urban hubs, typically with a coastal location, access to a port, that a foreign manufacturing firm can enter, employ large numbers of people, bring in inputs, and then export the outputs. So successful urbanization in the sense of that kind of city that is at least minimally functional in terms of logistics of the movement of people and goods, that's minimally safe. This will be a precondition for this process of bringing in foreign firms that can provide employment and provide skill. So what can the government do to encourage the urbanization that can make this possible? Now, before I answer that question, I want to talk about the scale of what we're looking at. If you just take the data on population in two regions defined by the UN, the more developed and less developed regions of the world. So you split those two regions and you look at population, and you just fit a logistic curve, the simplest curve that will kind of taper off to a constant level. If you estimate what the stable population is likely to be in the developed regions, it's around 1.3 billion. In the less developed regions, it'll be around 10 billion. So we can see how population growth will ultimately asymptote to something above 11 billion people. The dots here are the actual observations for these countries. The straight line is the predictions that come from a simple logistic. So if you take those population estimates and then link them to urbanization, where we can also look at the share of the population that lives in urban centers in these two different regions. From these two together, you can work out a prediction about the rate at which people will enter cities in the coming century. These two curves imply that we're near the peak in terms of millions of people per year who will move to urban areas, that this peak will be somewhere around 60, 70 million per year, and it will taper off over the course of the coming century. As this suggests, all of the action in this urbanization will be in the less developed regions of the world. The point that I want to make today is that the numbers here are very large. The implied change in urban residents in the developing world is about 5 billion people over the next 100 years. And that's more people than live in urban areas right now, substantially more. And if you multiply 5 billion by some estimate of what's the infrastructure cost per person, if you use $5,000, $10,000 per capita, you get to enormous numbers in terms of the infrastructure investment required. And as I said before, if you set that as a precondition before we can let this, this kind of reinforcing cycle work that could lead to all these benefits, you'll never get started. If you also think that aid is somehow the solution that breaks the logjam, gets you the infrastructure, if you just do the math, there's no conceivable amount of aid that will even show up as rounding error in the numbers that we're looking at here. So we can just set the whole discussion of aid aside and recognize that we're going to have a solution that doesn't make the investment in the infrastructure precondition for the benefits that we want to pursue here. Now, let me just talk briefly about why urbanization is a good thing. Historically, all countries that have become rich, so look at the log of income per capita on the horizontal axis, all countries that have become rich have also had big reductions in the share of their labor force that worked in agriculture. And initially, fast increases in the share of the population involved in manufacturing. Later, even faster, at the same time, increases in the service sector, and later, even faster increases in the service sector as manufacturing employment becomes a less prominent part of the economy. Both manufacturing and service sector employment are more productive in cities. Almost everything humans do is more productive in a well-run city. The only exceptions are things that intensively use land, like agriculture or, for example, minerals extraction. But the caveat here is that these things are more productive in a well-run city. And we have to think about what's the role of the government in encouraging the conditions that lead to well-run cities. The other argument I want to make to persuade you that urbanization is one of these big X variables we should look at involves looking at a scatter plot of the share of the population in urban areas against the log of income. In this case, I've got income on the vertical axis. This is a scatter plot for countries where we have data from 1955. Here, I've added the countries we have from 2010. And what we can do is look at the path that individual countries pursue as they make this general movement up and to the right. For example, we can look at India, which has recently been on a process where income is growing rapidly, but urbanization is actually not proceeding at a very rapid pace. Contrast that with Brazil, where we actually have rapid growth in urbanization. Both of these lines extend over this period, this 55-year period from 1955 to 2010. In Brazil, you have rapid growth in the urban share, but much lower growth in income per capita. The slope here is much flatter, and with log income, differences in slopes here lead to very big differences in income. So India is on a trajectory right now which would take it completely outside of the experience we've seen around the world in this process of urbanizing and becoming rich. Brazil is on a trajectory which could leave it very urbanized, but still relatively poor. If you look at China, if you think China is urbanizing too fast, that's not what the data suggest. It's actually on a trajectory that looks closer to the middle of this cluster. South Korea is also closer to the middle and proceeding over the same 55-year period much faster than China in terms of the amount of urbanization that's done and the growth in its income. So it's hard to argue from this data that China is either too urbanized for its level of income or getting income and getting urbanized too quickly. And finally, you can put in the United States, or we could have put in any other developed country, which is in the upper end of this cluster. It's growing more slowly because it's at the frontier. It can't take advantage of the kind of benefits of rapid catch-up growth that a country like China or South Korea can take advantage of. But it does suggest that if you want your country to end up looking like European countries, like North American countries, you need to be somewhere in this cluster that eventually takes you towards where the US is, rather than where India is headed or where Brazil is headed. So there are strategies that can try and lead to rapid growth without urbanization that, as in India, may soon reach a limit on how far they can go. There are strategies that can lead to rapid urbanization, as in Brazil, that didn't lead to the kind of reinforcing virtuous cycle that I described before. So the question here is, how can you urbanize effectively and get the kind of productivity advances and benefits that I'm arguing for in this story of circular causation? And keep in mind that getting urbanization right is not the only thing you have to do. You have to have the market economy. You have to make it attractive for firms to come in. You have to let people go take jobs that they want to take, even if it's initially at low wages. Now, what can go wrong in the process of urbanization? What's wrong with just saying, let the market handle it? This is a line drawing that my colleague Solly Angel did of a 60 square kilometer section of Bangkok. And what it shows is the almost total absence within this huge block of urban area, the total absence of arterial roads that could provide access to a bus that somebody could walk to and take to work. They could also provide the backbone for a sewer system or a water system, electrical wires that you bury, fiber optic cables. This kind of market-led individual development can lead to connections and a definition of public space that can be used for mobility and utility corridors, which will not be functional. And unfortunately, once this is determined, it's almost impossible to change later. This part of Thailand, or of Bangkok, is probably going to look like this forever. And this will mean that they'll never solve things like a traffic congestion problem that they suffer from in Bangkok, because there will never be enough public space for buses that somebody could walk to, a bus you could get to with less than with a half a kilometer walk and get to work. This is another picture that I took just from Google Earth. It's not of exactly the same area, but it uses a 1 kilometer red line here to show you the absence of arterial roads that you could use for the sewer system for buses. And the contrast I want to draw is with Midtown, Manhattan. This slightly obscured picture of a comparable 1 kilometer distance along 42nd Street shows you how many arterials in Manhattan cross. So you can see 5th Avenue, 6th Avenue, 7th Avenue. It extends even over to Madison Avenue. And I used this version of the Google Earth image to show that there are also a relatively dense set of skyscrapers along 42nd Street. Now, why is it that we ended up in Manhattan with this kind of much denser grid and so many skyscrapers along 42nd Street? Why didn't we end up with something like the picture from Bangkok? The answer is relatively straightforward. Someone drew a map in 1811, and on that map drew streets and avenues that took around 100 years to build out here in Manhattan. On that map, this person drew a slightly wider version of 42nd Street. Said arbitrarily, this is going to be a wider street than the other streets. And I'll put in, again, this same red line. That decision made by somebody in 1811 at a time when no one had any idea what kind of vehicles we'd now be using on our streets, what kind of buildings we'd be building. That decision on that map led to coordination that led to more skyscrapers in Midtown around 42nd Street than in other parts of Manhattan. Now, this kind of plan did not absolutely determine the course of development in New York City. If you look at the right end of this 1 kilometer line, you'll see the area where Madison Avenue should be, which is not on the original map. This was added later because the property owners who had the blocks defined by this map decided that their property would be more valuable if they added more north-south arterials. So these maps can be a guideline that structure development, that coordinate people's plans, but they're not rigid legalistic documents that have to be adhered to forever once they're established. But in providing this coordination function, they avoid the kind of mistake that is illustrated by the picture from Bangkok, and they create the possibility of the much better outcome that we see in Midtown Manhattan. One of the things Alain Berthaud, another of my colleagues, pointed out to me is that if you just take this map and look in Midtown and calculate what the person who drew this map implied for the fraction of land that is public space, this land that we use now for streets and sidewalks. No parks here, just streets and sidewalks. 30% of the land was set aside in this map for that kind of public space. And if you look at a favela that develops informally according to a market-like mechanism, you can end up with as little as 5% of the land devoted to this public space. And it's configured in a way which doesn't lead to the kind of efficiency benefits that this kind of more regular grid can provide. So that kind of decision about how much land is available for public space that can be used for mobility and utility corridors, that kind of decision is the kind of decision that only a government can make, and that if it makes it wisely, can have profound benefits centuries into the future. Now, the other point that's revealing about the history of the Commissioner's Plan in Manhattan and how it was developed was that when they determined the public space and the private space, they didn't try and build all the infrastructure, or they didn't build the infrastructure first, or take the land only when they were ready to spend on the infrastructure. As I said, they spent nearly a century building out the grid, and in the early stages, there were times when these streets were just dirt roads. This is Fifth Avenue. They paid for the construction of these streets by levying charges on landowners, like the owner of this plot here. It was up to the landowner to, if they wanted the entire plot to be down at grade level, the landowner had to incur that cost to lower the land. So that they could use a financing mechanism that could pay for the leveling of the roads, ultimately the paving of the roads, the building of the sewer system. They could use a system that financed that on a just-in-time basis, that built it in a just-in-time basis, but they had the public space defined for the entire island as they did this work. In the development of Manhattan, there were shanty towns I don't know whether there was the people in these kinds of shacks had any property rights. I suspect they didn't. I suspect they were just squatters. And you can see that this kind of squatter type development was present at the same time that the more formal construction of apartments or housing was taking place in the city. This is a view from the top of the Dakota apartments with Central Park on the left, looking south. And you can see that even though we started to get some important buildings that still exist, there were still these very informal settlements around this area. As Ed Glazer may mention later today, it took a long time for New York City to get organized to have something like a municipal water system. The Croton Aqueduct wasn't completed until 1840, which was long after this 1811 plan laid out all of these streets. So the path that we can imagine for urbanization in the developing world could look a lot like the path that we followed here in Manhattan, where you protect the public space from the very beginning. You identify it at a time that when the land is not so expensive, before the development has taken place. But then you build everything else on a just-in-time basis and finance it on an as-you-go basis. The sewers can come later, the water can come later, the streets can come later. Many people live in slums that, well, in New York, people used latrines until we had a sewer system. Many people in the world live in slums where they get water delivered to them by trucks now. And the path that we could pursue is one where you can't immediately solve this problem of getting a more safe, better municipal water system to them immediately, but you can still create the organizing principles about public and private space that will guide the city towards a path of productive, efficient urbanization that feeds this, this virtuous cycle that I described in the beginning. Finally, think about this kind of exercise of drawing the map, defining the public space, defining the private space. Think even about doing this in a country that's facing enormous pressure to accommodate the large numbers of people who want to move into cities. There's abundant land. It's easy to draw these maps. Imagine drawing a map like this and taking, if the government already owns the land or has some way to acquire land that has low value. Imagine taking half of the private plots, the squares defined by this kind of grid, and putting those out available to people along the lines of something like the Homestead Act in the United States, that people can get access to a site to build a very modest accommodation for themselves if they live there and occupy it for some period of time. Suppose you did that with half of the super blocks defined by your grid. Suppose the other half you auctioned off to private developers to lead to the more formal kind of city development. You could accommodate large numbers of people who know how to build their housing. Poor people all over the world build their own housing as long as they have a place where they can do it. So you could accommodate large numbers of people who come into a city. You could immediately make this a place where an employer would know that there are a large number of potential employees who work there. You'll know that you'll be able to manage the basic logistics of transport in the area because of the definition of the streets. And let me come back finally to refer to the rule of law that I mentioned. Imagine that a government undertook a program like this, said, these will be the public spaces, these will be the private spaces. We may use some of the private spaces as access for the millions, the hundreds of millions of people who want to move into cities in some countries. What would it take to make this work? You have to not only have a surveyor and somebody who can draw a map, but you have to be able to enforce the basics of the law. That space that is for the benefit of the public cannot be taken and used for private benefit. A squatter can't build a shack in the middle of what's supposed to be a road. A private developer can't block a part of the road. for his or her own development. So you need a government which will enforce the law in this minimalist sense that you don't let people privatize for their own benefit public resources. Now, if you do this in a context where there are places that people can go and build a shack, it will be easier to enforce. We see many instances around the world where governments can't enforce this notion that you can't take public space to build an accommodation for yourself. But these are all places where there's nowhere else to go for people who want to live in the city. So you can do this where you give an option to people. If you have to, you can do this by letting people organize land invasions. If the government can't take the private land for provide accommodations for poor people, if some of it's in private hands, these large blocks, you could let squatters do land invasions and squat on the private land if you had to, if that's the only way to get accommodations for people who want to move into cities. But what you need to do as a government is say that the fundamental principle in enforcing the rule of law here of property is that the public space has to be protected from attempts to privatize it for private benefit. And think about instilling a respect for the rule of law and legitimacy of the law if it's used this way, rather than to say protect the existing dominant position of a few landholders. If this notion of property rights and law really works to the benefit of the public, then you've got a feasible trajectory, not just for coordinated urban development that can turn out well, that gives you the flexibility to do things right in a city 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years later. But you've also got a mechanism for instilling this kind of respect for the rule of law and some legitimacy of the rule of law because it's serving a public benefit, not a private benefit for some elite. And with those two ingredients, you've got a shot at creating an environment like the one that prevailed here in New York after the development of this plan, one that can welcome immigrants from all over the world, where they can get their first job in garment assembly. And it's always garment assembly, whether it's Bangladesh or New York City. But it's a place immigrants could go, get their first job, and get this cycle of reinforcing positive causation started. Thank you. So I'm happy to take any questions. I think there are microphones in the two aisles here. So please, if you have a question, please come up to the microphone.
Hi, so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the way New York City eventually did finance some of its public services, whether it was through taxation or through some other mechanism, and what that implies for successful urbanization in developing countries.
Well, the building of the roads depended on a kind of tax, a levy that was imposed directly on the beneficiaries, who were the landowners that the road passed through. And that's actually, I think, that's a very effective kind of tax, and one that we should encourage more governments to plan for and to set expectations for as well. That for example, enforcing the rule of law, you might set the expectation not only that you can't take public space and then convert it into private space, but that the people who benefit from public services have to pay to get those benefits. So land taxes or property taxes are a very good way to enforce that kind of rule. And if you take it to the limit, you could say something like, we shouldn't see enormous windfall gains for property owners in a city, because those gains reflect value that's created by things that are done ultimately by the government, like making sure there's an infrastructure for mobility and utilities, making sure there's a police force and a judicial system that keeps people safe. So taxes on land should finance the things that actually make that land more valuable. And instead of having people think that land ownership is the way to get some windfall gain, we should really set this expectation that those gains should go to the entity which is helping create them, which is the government. Now, there are other kinds of fees that you can use, things like in building the subway system. You charge for the use of the system. What we've seen in many cities is that the fees, for example, for public transit, almost never pay for even the operation of the subway system or the metro transport system, let alone pay for the capital construction costs. But it may still be a very good idea to build that public transit system because the value of the land nearby goes up by so much when you've put it in place. So places like Hong Kong are using a kind of transit-led development where the transit agency owns some of the land around the stations, captures the value from developing that land into apartment buildings. That's another form of land value capture. And we should think, I think, more aggressively about using that kind of mechanism on top of fees and income or sales taxes.
Buenos dias. Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Carla Garcia. I'm from the Garifuna community in Honduras.
Okay.
And I work with Black fraternal organization of Honduras, of course.
Okay.
And my community, when we talk about mother cities or charter cities, we have a big problems with the government, you know. The government take our lands to construct this kind of project. And doesn't matter if we need continue living or we continue taking care of our community. My question is, because in this project, the government have the first word and the last word. How this project can make a link with the community, with the people, to make the different, real different. Or why the government don't ask the people in this kind of land, I'm sorry, I speak a little English, if they want this kind of project.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. So the brief answer is that in defining public space, like the roads, or even in the broader notion of public space, defining a place that could be a city that people want to move to, the government will always have to, almost always have to deal with some people who have some claims to that land. They might have a legal title to the land, or they may have traditional use rights in that land. And there will always be some process of negotiation between what's best for the people who are already using that land, as opposed to what's best for all the people who could use it. It's just like the negotiation that had to take place in Manhattan between the large landowners on the island versus the large numbers of people who wanted to come. Those negotiations are always hard, but the key thing to remember is that there are many, many sites where a city could be developed. And so if it's either expansion of an existing city or even a new city, as was contemplated in Honduras, there are many sites. And if a government that wants to propose an expansion of a city or the development of a city can't come to some kind of agreement with people in one area, there are other areas where they could go. So that it doesn't take a kind of a steamroller process of imposing a public will on a large community that doesn't want something to create this kind of opportunity for expansion. If you can't get a negotiation that leads to general agreement to do it in one place, there are lots of other places where it could take place.
I just have a quick question, regular one. Are there any recent successful examples of developing countries or cities that have applied some of these ideas that you mentioned?
I think Shenzhen is the most interesting example in our lifetimes. This is essentially a brand new city that was developed in China, close to Hong Kong, and it was important not just because it created the physical infrastructure like the public space for mobility that lets Shenzhen work, and not just because they also had informal areas that provided very low-cost housing for people. So not quite the kind of land invasions and squatter settlements I was describing, but something like that in the village townships that were kind of encompassed by Shenzhen. But above and beyond those two advantages, Shenzhen was, like New York, a place that welcomed immigrants, and it was a place where the Chinese people could try a different model that allowed foreign firms to bring in the kind of manufacturing opportunities that I was describing before. So if I were to point to an example that other countries could follow, I would say you should develop your own Shenzhen.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk about why cities might, what incentives cities might have to encourage rule of law. At the end there, you talked about the example of Bangladesh, where manufacturing jobs are, there's tons of them, but things like labor rights are almost non-existent. Why might a place like that encourage labor rights?
Yeah. So your question has two parts. One is, if you think about problems like what's holding Bangladesh back and continuing to create manufacturing jobs for people, one of the problems is congestion. I mean, Dhaka is just impossibly congested right now. So they don't have enough public space to accommodate the growth that they would like to pursue. I think the other question is a question about the capacity for enforcing the law. And as I was trying to suggest, governments have relatively little capacity in the early stages of development. So you have to think about where do you want to allocate that government capacity. You can think of that as the financial resources the government has. You can think of it as the people that it can employ and use. But there are only so many things they can do. So you have to figure out which is the most important thing to do. And finally, you have to decide what are the laws that you want to impose. And as I was suggesting, it might be counterproductive to impose a law which, for example, says that, say, every garment assembly firm that comes into Bangladesh has to pay a worker, say, $10 an hour as a wage. That might mean that Bangladesh is no longer competitive with other places where these firms can go. It might deprive people of that employment and learning opportunity that gets them on a path to higher wages. So things that on the face seem very reasonable, enforcing working conditions like the ones we're familiar with in North America, enforcing wages like the ones that we're familiar with here. Those might actually be counterproductive laws to enforce, even if you had the capacity to enforce them. Okay, this is going to have to be the last question, okay. Unfortunately.
Real quick, I hope. The starting point is government action to promote urbanization. Yeah. And I'm curious about whether there's any particular do's or don'ts with respect to external forces, the external World Bank, et cetera, intervening here. Things that, I mean, obviously there could be encouragement, resources, but are there ways in which, more subtly it can backfire and be detrimental?
Well, living in a global world creates enormous opportunities for poor countries that were not available 200 years ago. Before, for example, you couldn't think about industrializing unless you had achieved high levels of agricultural productivity. Ed Glazer may actually talk about this later today. But in today's world, if you can export manufactured goods, you can import food. So you don't have to become productive in agriculture first to industrialize. Also, you can bring in the technology, the managerial talent, the learning opportunities using, for example, multinational firms as potential employers. So you don't have to wait for the development of your own kind of managerial class and firms. So openness to the world that lets these potentially beneficial exchanges take place, I think, is a huge advantage. I think there's another advantage that we don't exploit much right now, but we could exploit, which are actually forms of trade in government services as well as trade in private services or private goods. If you're a government with little capacity, you could conceivably contract in certain key kinds of government services to even speed up this process. So being open to potentially beneficial exchanges with the rest of the world is a huge advantage and a policy worth committing to. On the flip side, there's a risk that if countries think that you can't urbanize until you get the infrastructure, and then the way to get the infrastructure is to plead for, basically for charitable donations of infrastructure, we're going to end up, forever waiting for infrastructure instead of waiting for Godot. Thanks.